Welcome back, warriors. This is my YouTube channel where we focus on educating the resistance and inspiring the next generation of warriors to help us protect our people and the planet. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the calls for justice from the final report of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. This video is the third in my series on the final report of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. And I will be talking to you about some of their most important calls for justice. But this shouldn't act as a replacement for you going out, pressing on the link that I have in the description box and reading all 231 calls for justice yourself. It is incredibly important that every single Canadian read them and figure out which areas that they can actually move forward and take action or support Indigenous women and girls or Indigenous governments or any of the governments in Canada move forward on these recommendations. Now, this report contains 231 calls for justice for all governments in Canada. That's federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous governments to move forward with a coordinated national action plan led by Indigenous women and girls to end genocide in Canada, protect Indigenous women and girls, and ensure a much better future going forward for all Indigenous women and girls. And it's also important to remember that this national inquiry wasn't an academic exercise. It wasn't a political exercise. This was a legal national inquiry that involved all the provinces and territories and the federal government, and the findings in their report are evidence-based and based on law. So we should take all of these recommendations very, very seriously and push governments to move forward on the National Action Plan to make sure we end genocide. Now, there's an important context for you to understand the recommendations and where the National Inquiry was coming from. So they actually start out the calls for justice by sharing 7 principles for change. And these included a focus on substantive equality, human rights, and Indigenous rights, a decolonizing approach, the inclusion of families and survivors in any plan going forward, self-determined Indigenous-led solutions being the key to moving forward, a distinctions-based approach so that there would be particular actions to be taken for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and they wouldn't be treated as one big pan-Aboriginal group. They also talked about cultural safety and a trauma-informed approach. Many of the people impacted, many of the survivors have long suffered trauma, and anything going forward, any plan going forward has to take that into account. Now, in addition to these 7 principles for change, they also talked about the 4 key findings in their report that should really provide the foundational context for understanding their 231 recommendations. Now, their 4 key findings, some of which I already talked about in the previous 2 YouTube videos. Number 1 is that Canada is guilty of genocide when it comes to the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Canada. That was their legal finding. And this genocide is the result of significant, persistent, and a deliberate pattern of racial and gendered human rights violations, Indigenous rights violations that were both historic and today. Their other core finding is that Canada is not only legally bound by all of the international treaties and declarations that it has ratified, but that part of the genocide that has happened against Indigenous women and girls in this country has actually come about by Canada failing to implement and failing to protect these rights for Indigenous women and girls, and they need to do so on a go-forward basis. Another significant finding is that Canada has purposefully separated or detached Indigenous women and girls from traditional Indigenous governance and leadership positions. They've done that through the Indian Act, but they've also done that politically and socially in all of their laws, policies, and practices. And that has really disrupted our traditional forms of government. And that needs to change going forward. And their fourth finding is that self-determination of Indigenous peoples is incredibly important for any plan moving forward. And that includes making sure that Indigenous women are part of that leadership process going forward. So when we talk about the calls for justice, they're organized into three general groupings. Calls for justice that are directed specifically at governments, and like I said, that's federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous governments. It's also focused on institutions, industries, and services. And finally, there's a page of calls to action that are specific for Canadians and their role moving forward to end this genocide. So under the first category of governments, the first recommendation is that all of these governments work together in a coordinated and comprehensive fashion to implement this national action plan to implement these recommendations, end genocide, and make life far better for Indigenous women and girls in this country. It also calls on all governments to implement their international treaty rights and human rights obligations, whether it comes from the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. They want governments to implement all of these and make sure that their laws specifically implement those. And more than that, they've also called on governments to implement all of the previous recommendations from all of those United Nations treaty and human rights bodies that have already talked about things that need to be done to end this crisis of grave human rights violations and genocide against Indigenous women and girls. In addition to addressing the grave socioeconomic conditions of Indigenous women and girls created by Canada, they also call upon Canada to eliminate sex discrimination in the Indian Act so that Indigenous women and their children will no longer be excluded from status and band membership. And they talk very specifically about UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and making sure that Canada not only adopts it, but amends all of its laws and constitution to be in compliance with UNDRIP, not the other way around, not trying to force UNDRIP to be compliant with Canadian laws, but to make fundamental constitutional changes. They also call to make sure that the basics of life, food, water, housing, education, and health are all available without barriers to Indigenous women and girls, that they address things like over-incarceration, and they also talk about making Indigenous languages official, not an after-school program, not minimal funding, not what's in the current legislation that's before Parliament, but actual official language status with all of the corresponding laws and funding that go with that. Now, there are obviously many more recommendations for governments, but then the report also moves on to industries, institutions, services, and partnerships that also impact this crisis of Indigenous women and girls. And they talk very specifically to media influencers, so media, broadcasting, entertainment, anybody in that world needs to adopt a decolonization approach to their work. They need to include more Indigenous women as media people, as commentators. They need to represent our stories in a discrimination and racism-free way. They also need to adopt various methods so that they are not hypersexualizing or promoting stereotypes against Indigenous women and girls, and allowing Indigenous women and girls to actually have their own voice instead of other commentators speaking for them. And I think some of these recommendations would make a huge difference going forward. Now, some of the other recommendations are geared at educators, police officers, social workers, healthcare workers, and they all have a similar theme. It's about being properly educated on the genocide that has happened and continues to happen, their role in it, what is the impact of racism, sexism, colonization, discrimination on the services provided to Indigenous women and girls, and to accept their own responsibility for that. And I think that's incredibly important moving forward, that this isn't just state actors who've done this. It's also all of these institutions and organizations that have had a role in it. Now, they made some very specific recommendations for corrections, for example, to completely end strip searches of Indigenous women and girls, both in prisons and youth corrections. And they also talked to the extractive industry about guaranteeing the safety of Indigenous women and girls throughout the whole project planning process. And that's something that's largely been left out till now, and that's why there's such high levels of violence against Indigenous women and girls anywhere near where there's resource development or extraction happening. Now, there's only one page of recommendations for Canadians, and I implore all of you to go, and that should be the first page that you read. And it's basically calling on Canadians to take active steps to call out, condemn, and speak out against racism and sexism and violence against Indigenous women and girls committed by all segments of society and all governments that have led to this genocide, that you all have a role in ending this. And they also call on Canadians to push governments to move towards this national action plan. It would be an absolute disaster if this national inquiry's final report and this recommendation for a national action plan fell out of the media in a week, and everybody focused on the election, and everyone forgot that there is an ongoing genocide in Canada. This should be considered the most urgent issue before us right now, and we should be acting accordingly. And we need all of you Canadians to be a part of pushing governments in this direction and not letting them off the hook, not letting them forget, and keeping the focus on Indigenous women and girls and their safety in this country. Thank you for watching my YouTube channel. I will post a link to the calls to action in the description box below, and I really encourage all of you to read it, and encourage everyone you know to read it and share it all over social media. Teach it in your classes if you're a teacher, talk about it with your families, and normalize taking action against genocide in Canada. And stay tuned for the next video in this series, which focuses on different aspects of the final report of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. If this is your first time here, please consider liking the videos, sharing the videos, leave me your questions and comments in the comment box below, and also hit that subscribe button to help support my channel. Till next time, stay alert, warriors.